We're truly humbled to be here in Venice. It is indeed a privilege and an honour to be given the opportunity to present our work in this historical city. For many, the holy grail in seeking an understanding of a diverse, translated and fused architectural history that is relevant to its unique identity. Having consideration to the curatorial theme of this architectural exhibition of time, space, existence, this presentation explores how the notions of Diaspora influence an approach to design not apparent in many monocultural identities, and its influence on an attitude to our work. For us personally, it has also offered the opportunity to reflect on our cultural heritage and examine the relevance of the influences of this country on our work, not only with a smile on our faces, but to pay homage to our parents who left this country and instilled and passed on to us the cultural values of the Italian way of life, but still kept a little bit of their hearts here for us to reconnect along the journey of life.
Canta una puerta sul napolitano, canta una potteramento, o golfo già scompare, e a luna mezzo mare, un po' che Napoli la fa vedere. Santa Lucia.
Mamma, a dove va il bastimento?
In America.
E a dove sta l'America? Da qua si vede.
No, sta al di là.
Al di là di dove sta?
Al di là di tutto.
E a dove sta papà? Io non lo vedo. Qual è?
Oh, là, noi, con fazzoletto in mano, noi.
Underlying the ethos of this presentation is a desire to reflect on the notions of Diaspora that often leads from a struggle and is born from confusion and a conflict of attitudes to a way of life in an adopted country, striving to hold on to past values and traditions without actually understanding that sometimes the world has moved on when you revisit. In turn, that emotional element of conflict in a life between two cultures also gives opportunity to better understand, share and integrate cultural heritage in a world seeking to distinguish itself between global and local. Our work is intrinsically linked to having recognition of our cultural background, resolving its connection with the effect of post-war migration to Australia and its translation into the urban design realm of our city, Adelaide, South Australia. The one notion that we've always tried to espouse is the respect or patriotic recognition of striving to understand our regional identity, an attitude that translates back to the parochial paese mentality that our parents always reminded us of through their storytelling. Tectvs evolved from a high school friendship linked through cultural and family values deeply embedded in our Italian heritage, that through family movement migrated and translated itself into the Australian landscape, now a multicultural country of many immigrant stories that helped establish, with time, a tolerant and respectful attitude to all things imported. Papa, Giuseppe Giannoni, took the boat to Australia in 1963 looking for a better life, from working on the land to earthworks to the Fornaci di Matone in Vasto, and in the long journey to Australia the demolition of homes, salvage yards and to roof tiling. Mum and I followed 6 months later, as was the way of the Assisted Passage Migrant Scheme. I was exposed to building sites at a very early age, although he reminds me that I did not like getting my hands dirty. So that's why you've become an architect, he said. Soft hands, mani morbidi, figlio mio. Mamma Assunta Massimi trained as a seamstress and dressmaker, an eye for detail and interpretation of patterns and design. Watching her cut valuable material from patterns designed in her mind, with no room for error, and watching these morph into beautiful dresses for people to celebrate life's personal milestones gave her great satisfaction. And in life's struggles in a new country, applying her craft for extra money at night to support the family. Sharing the backyard garage studio with her late at night while studying architecture, the attention to fine detail and the beauty of the visual aesthetic of fashion, the personal celebration of a new dress, to being seen, a la the passeggiata culture, is one of life's soulful experiences. It brings a smile, confidence, and if only for a short time, an escape. And is the way of life's sliding doors. Ornella Bonato also trained as a seamstress in her native Italy before migrating to Australia. I guess our mothers' backgrounds were only to be distinguished between Necchi or Borletti. It has been said that to the naked eye a suit appears to consist of two parts, a jacket and trousers. But those two seemingly solid parts are composed of 4 different fabrics: cotton, silk, mohair and wool. And those fabrics are cut into 38 separate pieces. The process of sizing, forming, co-joining these pieces requires no fewer than 228 steps. Remind you of architecture? Attilio Bonato also went to Australia looking for a better life. From the joinery shops of Venice, the dedication to detailed craftsmanship that he would lament was sadly lacking in his adopted country. He translated his Venetian-taught skills and beautifully detailed and layered veneer work into the Adelaide joinery and furniture manufacturing industry. Something that I had never seen before, and way above what apprentices and I were taught in our trade and technical schools. We remember the long talks about artisans and craft, the struggle to have the transition from handmade to manufacturing acknowledged, and the passion in which the storytelling was delivered. We believe our cultural heritage influences the way we design. It may be a simplistic notion in its nature, but there is no substitute for the struggle to achieve simplicity. Our work is varied, often translating between architecture and the urban realm. Perhaps the true ethos of our work transcends from working in building sites and joinery shops, dressmaking and patterns, but with a tradition and respect for all things produced by design, built by the artisan and made by hand. We have a huge contradiction in Australia in that we generally accept that as a young country, by the timelines of colonial settlement some 228 years ago, and having no periodical recognition of eras or dynasties, we often fail to recognise the fact that our Indigenous people, dating back some 60,000 years, are one of the oldest civilisations ever recorded. Yet we fail to draw on the inherent knowledge and memory invested in their culture because we have been so dogmatic to its relevance. In a new land of discovery, it's often easy to put down a new footprint and establish your supremacy. The first colonists in Australia did not try to understand country, nor the Indigenous way of habitat and shelter. They simply imported from their colonial roots. Perhaps if we recognise the Aboriginal people's built form, evolving from their connection and respect for their land, and minimal intrusive footprint, we may learn a lot more about the realities of our country's landscape and terrain. Sometimes it takes a while to wake up. Whilst recognising firstly the Indigenous ethos of designing with country, followed by the colonial provocation of disruption and infrastructure building, the contribution to the design and construction industries of the Diaspora in Australia, the work of migrants, the Italians, the Poles, the Dutch and others, and their way of thinking and building in a young country is important to analyse in searching for a departure in the way the Australian culture and lifestyle evolved. They are generally referred to as the Builders' Generation of Australia. Their construction skills sought and recognised post-war into the Building of Australia policy of the government of the time, which was the seed of the design and construction diaspora into Australia. Translated into the Australian landscape, it brought century-old skills and methodology, and more importantly, a differing mindset to an understanding of design and culture. In particular, those migrants that worked on the Snowy Mountain scheme between 1949 and 1974, and later found their way into the Australian construction frontier. From the design perspective, the work of Enrico Taglietti and later Romaldo Gigerla brought a new cultural enrichment to the way we design and offered an exploration of the value of design and art principles that have enriched the Australian lifestyle. These now ingrained values reflect and denote a recognisable shift from the rigid colonists to the values of multicultural traditions, probably more aligned to First Nations respect to country than the disruption of colonialism. As custodians of this translated culture, it is important for our generation to recognise and analyse their contribution. And as the Morbido generation, the notion of design is entrusted to us to build upon the ethos of their work. We do not subscribe to an international or global view on design. Rather, we would like to think that our work traces from our upbringing and respecting the values of life and the cultural landscape that is installed in us. An approach of responding to region, seeking not so much an identity, but the way we touch and feel our city and the ultimate respect for Paese. The influence and design of the seeds of Diaspora lies in a search for the need and curiosity in looking and searching for clues in identity. It entrusts in our multicultural makeup and understanding in participating and respecting the values of other cultures. The question, though, always remains through the design process. Is the style or aesthetic of building translated into a foreign landscape, conflict, or mediatory in a tolerant society? Our journey begins some 47 years ago as friends from high school. A common appreciation for architecture, as only 17-year-olds could understand. Sitting on the steps of Franz Athelstan House after a failed entry into the architecture course, talking to his father about what to do. Boys, go back and follow your dreams, he would say. Another year is meaningless in the scheme of things. Looking back, our work has been a backdrop to our way of life. We take it seriously and are always respectful of each other's individualism, which blends into a truly collective and collaborative portfolio. From high school to university to studios in the formative years of our training, we have worked together through this journey and shared some common influences. Tectvs was founded without reference to individuals, rather a collaborative studio that individuals could share, espouse and grow within the studio collaborative of the artisan. We are often asked, Tectvs, what is its derivative or meaning? Well, it comes from Latin. It's pronounced Tectvs. And a definition by dictionary, hidden, secret, reserved, close. For us, its meaning lies in the mystery of the everyday as an enjoyed experience, the simple notion of life and living. When you first begin your studio, you subliminally seek to distinguish yourself from others. It is your freedom and the opportunity to express yourself and voice your view of the world. But it is not without influence in regard to ethos. Firstly, we were blessed to have worked some leading design practices and the trust put in us from the early age by Rod Roach, heavily influenced an attitude to design and confidence in the clarity of the idea. In the South Australian context, Rod's studio was one of the first true studio-based practices, often collaborating with others. The idea was always the most valued part of what we did and reflected the design ethos of the European practices, something that sat very comfortably with us and resonated with our cultural heritage. There is no doubt that the work of Carlo Scarpa has never loomed far from our minds as a master of detail, craftsman and the sublime. His work presents a cultural link and traces a philosophical diaspora in our attitude, together with the biannual pilgrimage. The work of Mario Botta in our early days was referenced, and what a privilege to be able to hear him speak and be on the same program as part of Banta Architettura in Italy a few years ago. Eventually visiting his studio in Mendrisio and experiencing his work in the establishment of the Accademia di Architettura in Mendrisio, Switzerland, a major contribution in founding one of the most relevant and standalone schools of architecture for the next generation. In the formative years of our studio, we had the privilege of listening to the 2007 Australian Institute of Architects gold medalist Enrico Taglietti discuss his work and influences. He was born in Milan in 1926. His family moved to Ethiopia in 1938 and returned to Milan in 1947, where he was educated at the Politecnico between 1947 and 1952. He arrived in Australia in 1955 to coordinate an exhibition of Italian design on behalf of the Milan Triennale for David Jones, and consequently fell in love with Canberra and stayed on, a place he described as an invisible city with a blank canvas. We had dinner with him that night, and in true Italian spirit over a bottle of red wine we talked about the influences of his work, his struggle in establishing in Australia, and the Italian influence of a migrant architect working in Australia. That night resolved a clarity in philosophy emanating from cultural heritage that resonated strongly with us, with a group of young architects, of second-generation Italians, led by a master of storytelling and a body of work that captured all the essences of what we were trying to encapsulate. In his gold medal lecture and many later interviews, he summarised his approach to design and influences from his studies at the Polytechnical. I had quite a lot of discussion with Pierluigi Nervi, the engineer. His idea that if one gives to 10 people the same problem to solve, and that they would solve that problem properly, everyone should arrive at the same result. I was totally against that, and I said I wanted to be slightly freer. So that was the education that I had until the last couple of years when I discovered Bruno Zevi. I found that finally I had a possibility of choice between codification or scientific rationalism and poetry. And that, I said, is what I want to know. I want to become a poet and not a scientist.
I didn't agree with Pierluigi Nervi in relation to, again, the fact that if you produce architecture that is totally controlled and totally taught, he said you had only one solution. You cannot have 3 solutions, 4 solutions. One solution. If you're right, it's one solution. And I couldn't possibly accept that. I thought that every mistake that you make was better than the one that was right.
Although our work will never be exposed in the esteem of this great man, that night reinforced a few issues into our subliminal approach. The influence on design of this Diaspora architect was with tolerance and understanding across many cultures, and the passion for articulating his thoughts with mastery. It was about life, living, celebrating, storytelling, and memory. It was not a mathematical formula. Many years on, I've had the privilege to be able to teach at the Politecnico di Milan in its Mantua campus within the framework of our Adelaide University International Workshops, and through invitation to speak at Mantua Architettura. There is much emotional resonance and a ritual of passage every time I've walked through those doors. We were fortunate in the early years of practice, amongst the global recession of the late 1980s, to inherit the trust of Mancorp, 2 visionary Greek property developers. They had, against all odds, been given the rights to develop the Rundle Street environment of the East End precinct of Adelaide, which consisted of the old fruit and vegetable market, together with Max Liebman, another migrant developer. Theo and Bill's vision for the East End would change the way Adelaide perceived a street culture, one that we fitted in with very easily. Rather than demolish and fight with heritage, they embraced the opportunity to respect it, based on their cultural heritage and an understanding of how the European street culture would be an important element in the revitalisation of a precinct. Respecting that origin of these buildings traced to the wholesale distribution of fruit and vegetables in the formative years of the state added another plethora and remnants of migrant market gardeners that brought life into the city from 2 a.m. in the morning. With breakfast in the local cafes and stalls before heading back to the market gardens and the fruit and vegetable shops. These markets and the connecting spaces between the colonial buildings were the first true laneways of Adelaide.
You know why this place has worked here? I'll tell you many reasons, but I'll tell you the main reason. First, it was a team effort. Yes, we're the developer, but we had good architects, people who understood, because it's a magnificent example of what fits into the space of an old building. And we had the public with us.
The design philosophy behind the revitalisation was to connect with people. It had to resonate with the ground level urban realm, the streets, the people, a translated culture that brought people back into the precinct through festivals, gatherings and celebrations. The area introduced the first street dining precinct in Adelaide and the largest grouping of adaptive reuse in our city, one building at a time. And as is recounted by a former Premier of the state, I now understand what alfresco dining is all about. I guess these sons of migrants had successfully transplanted their culture into the city, the effect of the seed of the Diaspora. Over a period of some 30 years, we have transformed the buildings that define this precinct, and so did the first new buildings in 100 years, to much antagonism from the conservationists and authorities. Now going through a second revitalisation under the guidance of a new generation, and in instances with a brand new hand of design reflecting the changing aesthetic and activities of the area, something which we subscribe to in an evolving city fabric. As our studio heads back to reside in the East End, our anointed spiritual home, the notions espoused by our work in this precinct have been by translating and infusing our small increment into the Laikai, to add a small trace of life into the everyday of the city. And so began the journey into what we believe is a body of work that represents the evolving face of our state and our interpretation of the fabric and fine grain of our city. Presented through the everyday and our mantra, to live, to work, to play, the body of work is an overview of the workings of a city, the sum of the increments that formulate an urban realm. And along the way, restaurants to rewrite the aesthetic and introduce art and architecture. Residential inner-city townhouse living that broke the colonial aesthetics. First major apartment buildings in Adelaide that transformed an apartment living adaptation. One of the largest body of infill medium density residential work and a design influence infrastructure portfolio. Adelaide, South Australia is not a large international city, but it is constantly referred to as one of the most livable cities in the world. Planned in 1836 as a garden city translated for the European schools of design into Australia by arguably Colonel William Light, it presents an enigma in its an organic concept, in that its core is defined by a military-style, straight-road grid network. The parkland shroud that defines the transition between the CBD and suburbia, currently under consideration for a UNESCO World Heritage nomination, allows the lungs of the city to breathe, is increasingly under attack from the stress of urbanisation. And as its custodians, we need to ensure its validity is maintained for future generations. In its Australian context, we are often referenced as the driest city in the driest continent, which entrusts us to the practice of environmental and sustainable responsive design and to have a high regard to the preservation of our natural resources. Step outside the city environment and the state landscape becomes harsh, challenging and confronting. Our regional projects provide a clue to the elemental design factors that require response. These projects are a reminder of the extremities and dangers of exposure that need to be faced and the protection afforded to the design of shelter in the extremities responding to climate. Another component of our portfolio is our adaptive reuse work. We consider it to be a great honour to be given the keys to somebody else's work to contribute and build upon. Many of the great buildings built over hundreds of years have had many architects. Many of our adaptive reuse projects, mainly 20th century building readaptations, have been difficult in that they require a discipline to understand the ethos of the previous designers, to have a sublime dialogue with them, build upon their values and to respect and adapt these buildings to the current way of life, often causing havoc with the minds of the pure conservation architects and the urban rationalists that would prefer that our cities live as a museum to some notion of relic. We pose the question as to whether the element of struggle in the Diaspora, not leaving anything behind, frugalism, and the desire to leave traces of memory that gives us a focus to readapt and restore rather than demolish and rebuild is of relevance and analysis of the work. In the overall theme of this presentation, it is in many respects a reflection of how the attitudes of the Diaspora were able to influence its city's identity. Perhaps a recognition of a growing maturity of the life cycle and encapsulation of memories in existing buildings more attuned to the Diaspora notions of multiculturalism. Over the years, we've had the privilege to work with diverse Eastern cultures, Chinese, Hindus and Buddhists, and translate their needs of their Diaspora. The notion always remains the same: respect and celebrate their culture and aesthetics. Don't try to convert them to the global manifestation of design. You will find the experience of transcendental design a lot more rewarding and enriching into your value system. And that is why I think we're entrusted and work easily with other cultures. We always strive to understand their traditional values and ethics, and we work with them without prejudice to a style that is often not recognised, glorified or fashionable. In many respects, the TAP workshop program between Adelaide University, Tongji University and the Politecnico di Milano connected cultures in design to be respectful of each other's region and respond to the loci rather than import their preconceptions. Some years ago we ventured into seeking design work in China. What evolved out of that experience was reverse commissions. Rather than espousing their work to us in their homeland, they were more comfortable with us doing work in Australia based on our respect for and understanding their culture. Rather than instilling a predetermined Australian aesthetic, it resolved the notion of memory and the concept of diaspora. Memory is important for us to instil into projects. To leave some trace and translate a little bit of home and cultural background into projects is of great value. It may not be pure regionalism, but cultural fusion is an important part of our design attitude in translated culture, and tracing the notion of memory on design in a multicultural country. As much as I've learnt from my cultural background in an adopted country, I have also learnt much from discussions with Eastern cultures and their attitudes to the beauty of life, which spawns from a much simpler and pragmatic approach to house shelter. Buildings may capture emotion, but the soul must be happy and willing to accept that emotion. It's not enforceable, as some of the great modernists have found. We were asked a few years back to give a talk at the Chinese Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing on the influence of the internet on design, a constant struggle of overexposure and self-grandeur in today's globalised world. Even a time-honoured institution such as this, so ingrained in its ancient cultural philosophy, a calligraphy to the humble way they have seen the world, is today grappling with the me emotion of the next generation and how it should form part of training designers. Their resolve, infusing old and new, has been embraced with a passion that still holds on to, firstly, the belief of the idea, and secondly, that of capturing emotional well-being. As being the non-negotiable aspects of design, the things that we are left with as designers once technology absorbs all other aspects of the process. We are often asked about our architecture, our style, our philosophy, and our attitude to design. We don't focus on a predetermined approach or language in our work. Like life and the everyday, there is no formula, just an involvement and displacement over the years to attitudes, beliefs that comes with maturity and response. A new project always excites in its inception, the strong link between sensory perception, time, place, and emotion. And the vision to encapsulate a space defines the beginning of the design process. Or maybe is it just how we feel on the day? Sometimes as we move into the realms of adjunct academia as we have, the notions of research into design can become abstract and meaningless in a search for some higher notion of experience and living. Many espouse the philosophical rationalism of some imaginary sensory perception that would have no relevance or contribution to our lifestyle or well-being. To us, design is much simpler than that. Its origins are reflective of who we are and the way we live. It's a simpler way to resolve design rather than theorise in the abstract. Whilst we strongly acknowledge that research is essential in forms of advancing knowledge, the basics of providing shelter, which is the domain of architecture, whether it be spiritual, habitual, or purely functional, we hope will and still remain in the understanding of the most simplistic basis of humanity, that of well-being and having a good life, the primary influential ethos of our work. As I observe the storytelling in Francesco's PhD, design making, an interlocutory of cultures and craft, it provokes a conflict between the scientific evidence-based rationalism expected from academia that is often in strong conflict with acknowledging and recognising that there is just as much merit in discovery of the emotional recall of storytelling and poetry. And it reinforces the notion of the cultural struggle and conflict alluded to as part of this presentation. Passage has allowed us to realise that our original Tectvs ethos connected strongly with Enrico's thoughts, the freedom in the poetry rather than the scientific rationalism. In time, the elements of initial conflict in the underlying notions of cultural dysphoria are often the ones that end up being highly valued in the translated and diffused culture, many years on by the next generation. And that is why we consider it is our responsibility to pass on the traditions and the storytelling as the final elemental design process of the Diaspora. In our world, the links of the day-to-day practice and the traditions of celebration, food and wine are important in our lifestyles, and is something that we've always shared and sought as a translated generation to uphold these traditional forms of the everyday. Still holding on to past traditions, the making of our small goods, the Mayali Day, the Sauce Day. To us, it's part of the street and footpath culture translated from the Paese and the Campagna. The art of storytelling and the responsibility of giving back is an important element in the notion of passage. It is the storytelling of who we are, where we come from, and our mythological and spiritual base. It's not something that comes easy for colonists who tend to enshrine everything in constitution and legislation to uphold the historical high ground. It is something that is embedded in our make-up and belief system, passed on from generation to generation, from a well-told folk story to the art of handmade produce and improvised temporary shelter. This studio has always taught at the universities, represented the Australian Institute of Architects, and contributed to the Venice Biennale. We have chaired the Architects Board of South Australia, reset contemporary accreditation panels, sat on housing boards, taught and delivered keynotes internationally, and served community, Rotary, Legacy, School Council, and advocated for shelter and those in need. I've had the privilege to serve as the 2022 National President of the Australian Institute of Architects through the disruption of the pandemic. For a migrant 4-year-old child who spoke not one word of English on their first day at school, I'm humbled to have been the first Italian surname to be added to the roll call of national presidents. I feel greatly privileged to have had the Jorn Utzon Presidential Medallion on my Adelaide desk. We touched at the beginning of this presentation on the conflict of diaspora, that of being torn between cultures. Sometimes the emotion or feeling of being on the wrong side, food, language, aesthetic, and the road to acceptance. Does this impact on our work, or more precisely the aesthetic of architecture? The notion of a non-establishment practice to struggle, to strive for acceptance, or on the acceptance to practice with equality, is not lost on reflection in our journey. The maturity of a culture is only reflected when there is no boundary between the acceptance of others' beliefs and aesthetic, nor which school tie you wore. The fight and continuing struggle for commanding respect as a local practice in a globalised world is an issue confronting the future of the design industry. The local decision makers come and go, seek the nationals and internationals, and don't really give much credence to the local talent. We would like to believe that our work identifies who we are, where we come from, and where we have been. Maybe our story is unlike the general monographs of work presented, but I believe our translated cultural background defines an approach not apparent in monocultures, rather one that recounts a cultural process of design represented by the struggle and eventual passage. So where are we with our work? A certain clarity evolves with the comfort level and respect to your own beliefs and values, and a responsibility to establish the passage to the next generation, to simply being at ease, to be able to do predominantly beautiful, meaningful work that connects with the needs of people, and that of being a humanitarian principled studio. That is our journey. Grazie.